All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. Hope you enjoyed getting your Wu-Tang on for a little bit here. Um, Sorry, my camera is a little weird. I am Anne Ishimaru, and we want to welcome you to today's Leading Towards Justice series. Today's part of a monthly series that's going to run till June, and it's co-sponsored by the Leadership for Learning program, the Danforth Leadership Program, the Just Ed Leadership Program, and is support as well from the Corbally Fund and the Educational Foundation's Leadership and Policy area of the College of Education, University of Washington. We are so honored today to be engaging in a conversation and hearing from the author of Radical Care, Leading for Justice in Urban Schools. We're also going to have the opportunity to engage and hear from U.S. Congressman Jamal Boatman. So as I said, I'm Anne Ishimaru. I'm an associate professor of Educational Foundations, Leadership and Policy, and also director of the Just Ed Leadership. And I'm joined this evening with my colleague, Dr. Anthony Craig as well.
Thank you, Anne. Good evening, everyone. Like Anne said, I'm Anthony Craig, director of the Leadership for Learning program in the College of Ed. We're very happy and honored that you all are taking this time to spend with us, to engage with our guests, and to engage with each other as we work to enact leadership toward justice and community well-being.
So this entire series is premised on a notion that comes from an Indigenous teaching. Leadership is about relations, it's about responsibilities, it's about understandings and actions within the community, not about a single person with a particular title. And so here in the university, those teachings come from particular places and lands and people. Here at the University of Washington, we are on the lands of the Coast Salish people who have stewarded these lands and waters and lifeways since time immemorial, and they continue to do so. So we're really grateful for their original leadership, indebted to the wisdom and the relations that they extend to those of us who, like me, are uninvited settlers on these territories, but also acknowledge and appreciate the knowledge that they continue to share with us. We also want to acknowledge the stolen labor of those enslaved from Africa, as well as the labor of immigrants who have built this country, and to really think about how do we move from statements and just acknowledgements like these that have come to be very routine for us, to actually ensuring that we're working in solidarity with and moving in solidarity towards Indigenous sovereignty, and working with Black and other immigrant and other people of color communities to realize more just schools and more just society.
Thank you, Anne. I myself am a citizen of the Yakama Nation, which is about 2.5 hours from where our university is situated now geographically. I'm also a descendant of Suquamish and Puyallup nations, which are the original stewards of the land where the university sits. And I live in the community of the Tulalip tribes. I offer all of this both to call my ancestors into the space, to hope that my work is pleasing, but also to acknowledge the leadership of folks like Anne Ishimaru, who really strive to make these statements move beyond something that we read or state at the beginning of something. And we humbly put this sort of work that we're doing tonight forward as a way that we truly intend to bring justice to these territories and beyond. And we think that in doing so, we honor Indigenous people who have been here forever, will be here forever, and it'll benefit everybody. A note about the recording. So thank you, Anne, for always setting us up in that way. This session will be recorded and available to those of you who have registered. So if it helps you to know, you can go back and view it. There's that option. Closed captioning is also available, so look for the box to access that. And if you don't see it, go ahead and message us in the chat and someone will help you with that. And we encourage you to use the chat both for our guests and each other to interact this evening, but for our follow-up session that we'll make sure to mention again as we close tonight's session. So back over to Anne.
All right, so I get to introduce Dr. Rosa Rivera McCutcheon, and then a little bit later, Congressman Jamal Bowman will be joining us. So Dr. Rivera McCutcheon is a fellow scholar mama who I first got to know as we were leading some equity work in our field's educational research conference. And over the years, she's come to be a collaborator and a dear friend. And I'm just so excited that we get to be in conversation with her and all of you who are joining from all over the place. Lots of folks from New York, I love it. But also folks from all over the country. I see folks from Texas and folks here locally in Washington. So it's wonderful to be able to have these kinds of conversations. Dr. Rosa Rivera McCutcheon is a professor of leadership studies at CUNY Lehman College, a Hispanic serving institution in Bronx, New York, where she also serves as the coordinator of building and district leader graduate programs. She's a doctoral faculty member in the Urban Education PhD program at CUNY Graduate Center. An educator for over 20 years, Dr. Rivera McCutcheon is a first-generation college grad who began her career as a high school teacher in the Bronx before earning her doctorate at NYU. Her research is informed by her experiences attending and teaching in New York City public schools. Dr. Rivera McCutcheon's work focuses on urban school leaders who practice radical care, centering anti-racism and equity as part of their leadership work. Her research has appeared in many journals: Educational Administration Quarterly, Urban Education, Journal of School Leadership, and she is the author of this terrific book we're going to discuss tonight. Jamal Bowman was born and raised in New York City, spending his early years in public housing and later in rent-control apartments. He didn't have a lot growing up, but his mother provided him all that he needed: love, a stable family, and a sense of community. Jamal now lives in Yonkers with his wife and 3 kids. He's worked as a teacher and a principal, and he founded Cornerstone Academy for Social Action in Baychester in the Bronx. Congressman Bowman was elected to the U.S. Congress during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic and has deep roots in the district. He always ensures that the voices of working families can be heard loud and clear in Washington. So I'm really excited because we're going to have an opportunity to hear from him and also hear about the kind of leadership that he enacts that really evokes and embodies these ideas of radical care. So thank you so much, Dr. Rivera McCutcheon, for joining us tonight.
I'm really pleased to be here. I just texted Congressman Bowman and he replied, he's jumping on. He was meeting with Bernie, who I can only assume is Congressman Senator Bernie Sanders. So, you know, just a little old thing like that. So I'm really so thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be in conversation, not only with my students virtually here from the Bronx, but also with my dear friend, Ann Ishimaru, who I've really had the privilege of coming to know and love and laugh with and be snarky with via text, as well as Dr. Craig. And I'm really, really gratified to have been invited by the University of Washington's College of Education and to be a part of this Leading Towards Justice series, who you've brought in so many wonderful people last year, this year, there's more to come. And so I'm really thrilled and honored to be included in the conversation alongside these really powerful people. And I also want to thank, in absentia until he arrives, my friend, who I'm also proud to call my congressman, Dr. Jamal Bowman, who is going to be making time, obviously, from his busy schedule as a congressperson, who's constantly in motion and is, you know, fighting the powers that be to make time and be in conversation with me tonight. So the bulk of this evening's event is going to be a conversation between Congressman Bowman and myself, but I want to take the first 10 minutes or so to provide a really brief overview of the key points of the book, Radical Care, Leading for Justice in Urban Schools, and to provide everyone with some context to the conversation that I'm going to engage in with the congressman. And then, you know, we'll have an opportunity for lots of Q&A, and I certainly encourage people to drop comments, questions, to snaps. I saw some hearts floating up. I don't know how to do that, but feel free to do those things. A couple of quick caveats. I have animals and I have people. They're sort of interchangeable. I may tell my teens and the animals to be quiet. They may or may not listen, as is, the nature of things. So I just want to put that out there and hope that they are listening to me, both the animals and the people. So I'll get us started with just beginning to share my screen. So, and let me get my Zoom situation all set up here so that I can see all of the things and move all of the things so that I can see people and things. So I want to start us off today by asking you to think about a time that you felt cared for as a student in school. So you can think about that as your time in a K-12 setting or beyond, right? And I want you to just think, what were the circumstances and what were the feelings, right? And why does it stand out for you? Feel free to drop that into the chat and you can read each other's comments and thoughts about that. And I want you also then to think about a time when you didn't feel cared for in school, right? What were the circumstances? What were the conditions? Why does that stay in your mind these years later? So again, when you felt cared for and when you did not feel cared for. So think about that, and hopefully these concepts, these ideas start to resonate as I talk to you a little bit about radical care. And so a lot of my thinking about radical care begins with my own personal path in education and those moments when I did feel cared for and when I didn't feel cared for. I am a Spanglish speaking Puerto Rican. As Anne mentioned, I'm a first generation college graduate. I grew up in a predominantly working class Black community in Queens, New York, where I attended New York City public schools from grades kindergarten through 12th grade. And I generally did well in schools. Although, I sort of hit a few bumps along the road when I was in middle school. And so in New York City, what that means is, because you have to apply to high school in New York City, what that meant is that I didn't get into the high schools that I applied for. And I would have had to have gone to my zone school, which had fewer opportunities and options. And so my mom, who didn't have a college degree, was a high school graduate, but was, really and continues to be one of the smartest people I know, really made some moves and tried to make sure that I had opportunities in high schools. And she got me into a college prep program at a public high school that was also a STEM program. And what that did is it gave me a bunch of opportunities that I might not have had if I'd attended my locally zoned school, right? And so as a result of that opportunity, I did really well in high school, and I was able to attend the University of Rochester, which is a private, predominantly white college in upstate New York, about 6 hours north of that. But beyond the cultural shock that I experienced when I arrived, having gone to schools that were predominantly Black and brown, I was incredibly shocked to learn really quickly that I was underprepared for the rigors of college, despite having been declared college ready in my college prep program. And I especially struggled in the area of writing, right? I had never been asked to write long papers, to type anything, certainly not to write anything longer than 2 pages. I wasn't asked to research. I wasn't asked to revise. And there weren't lengthy papers like the ones that I was asked to write when I arrived at the University of Rochester, right? And so I constantly found it really hard to meet the minimum requirements for pages and for some of the content in my college courses, no matter how hard I tried. But my professors recognized that I had really good ideas and that I was trying. And so they usually gave me A's or A minuses on my papers or in my classes. Now, in the spring of my sophomore year, I earned a C on a paper for the first time in an African American Studies course that was taught by Professor Karen Fields. And I remember that name because she was one of the first, if not only at that point, Black professors that I had had up until then. And I want to make note of the distinction that I am making between being given A's or A minuses and earning a C. in a course, right? Professor Fields, when I went to speak to her about this paper and this grade and not understanding and my shock, she explained to me that my writing needed a lot of work and that she wasn't going to inflate my grades like some of my white professors had done. She told me that I could and I should do better. She expected more from me. And I did rise to Professor Fields' expectations. She made it very clear to me. But that conversation was a real shock for me because none of my teachers, my professors, my teachers had ever mentioned anything to me about my writing and about the challenges and about areas of improvement. They had really understood their actions to be caring, right? Because they knew I had good ideas and they knew that I was trying hard. But in fact, as I reflected on it, what I realized is that their actions more closely resembled pity and lowered expectations. And those are qualities of something that I call limiting care. Now, limiting care inhibits structural transformation, right? But it is, despite good intentions, it actually ends up doing more harm than good. So I went on to start my career. I got my master's and I started my career as a teacher in the Bronx, again, as Anne said. And that was also quite a shock, right? My high school students, my ninth graders, came to me really tremendously and utterly underprepared, having been failed by an educational system that had been enacting limiting care year after year, lowering expectations for them. But I'm ashamed to admit, as I reflect back on my experiences, that when my colleagues and I would come across a student who would be able to write a decent essay, we were effusive in their praise and we declared them college ready. And we thought, okay, it's really amazing. You're doing a great job. And not surprisingly, when those students went off to college, very often they ended up leaving school, not just because of the cultural shock, but also because they weren't prepared academically, despite what we had said to them. And I had lowered my expectations about what they could accomplish because their life circumstances were challenging. And by doing that, I also lowered the expectations for myself and what I could accomplish for those students, because I failed to demand and expect excellence of myself and of them. And I had been practicing limiting care with them, just as my professors and my teachers before had enacted limiting care with me. And so I think a lot about care, and very often when you talk to educators about why they came into the field, why they became teachers or leaders or librarians or social workers, et cetera, very often the reason that they share is because they care about kids. But too often the kind of care that we see or talk about in education really is actually limiting care. And very often, the language of care is framed as a dichotomy. It either exists or it's absent, right? But I argue that it's more nuanced and in many ways more dangerous, because limiting care is typically coming from a place of goodwill, but it actually does a lot of harm, right? So educators are going to tend to focus on what's standing in the way of a child being successful, and in the interest of supporting them, they make things easier for the students to be successful by accepting mediocrity or asking students to do less. And those long-term effects, the impact of those lowered expectations, are so profoundly limiting for individual students, but it also stands in the way of structural transformation. So when we practice limiting care, we're ignoring these structural inequities that can really only be dismantled by enacting radical care. Since early on, my research has focused on understanding how academic success and caring relationships could coexist in schools who serve Black and Latinx students. And the radical care framework emerges from that question and my study of leaders and leadership in Bronx schools over the years, and especially on the leadership of Congressman Jamal Bowman's time as a principal at Cornerstone Academy for Social Action Middle School. So the framework, the radical care framework, has 5 different components. And I really want to emphasize that these components work synergistically, right? It's an aspirational framework. All pieces aren't always in play, but ideally, what we are trying to do is enact all 5 of these components. And I'm just going to read a short section from the book to give you an overview of radical care, and then welcome Congressman Bowman in conversation with me. So leaders who adopt an anti-racist stance are unapologetically committed to understanding the role that racism has played in maintaining oppressive systems within educational systems and within the schools they lead. Their anti-racist lens allows them to critically examine the institutional policies and systems that maintain oppression for Black and Latinx students and communities. And more importantly, they engage their teachers and broader school community in engaging in anti-racist work. As a result of adopting an anti-racist stance, leaders who practice radical care are attuned to critically examine school practices and systems, and they actively work to disrupt institutional oppression in all forms. This anti-racist stance informs all aspects of the work of leaders practicing radical care, including working to cultivate authentic relationships with their students and families, as well as the educators in their school. As anti-racist practitioners, they're mindful of engaging their communities from an asset-based approach, and they seek to understand the historical and institutional oppression that has impacted those communities. These relationships, which are grounded in mutual trust, allow the leader to leverage them to demand excellence from students and teachers. Here too, radical care, an anti-racist component, is activated because rather than embracing a deficit perspective that limits possibilities for students and teachers, leaders who practice radical care demand excellence because they fervently believe that it is possible to achieve. It's not a matter of leaders having high standards to satisfy a mandate. Rather, it is a function of a leader practicing radical care who understands when the barriers that limit their students and teachers' capacity to exceed their potential are dismantled, excellence is infinitely possible. Leaders who practice radical care also leverage their power to enact critical changes within their schools and to advocate for broader systemic reforms, all in the interest of dismantling barriers that are the byproducts of systemic oppression. The drive for transformation is informed by an anti-racist mindset and a moral imperative to leverage power for good. It is also informed by a spirit of radical hope that urgently imagines and agitates for more just and equitable possibilities for Black and Latinx children in schools. And I want to take this opportunity to introduce my friend and my congressman, Dr. Jamal Bowman, who when he defended his dissertation, I purchased this shirt for him because this was exactly what I knew he was going to do, which was to conquer the frickin' world. And so Congressman Bowman, welcome to the conversation.
Hey, what's up? Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Rosa. Good to be with you. Thank you for having me. Yes, that was a great picture, great t-shirt, and great moment. And yeah, what was that? That was January 2019. And it was freezing cold, really cold, really cold. And yeah, 6 months later, I was announcing a run for Congress. So that's kind of crazy. But
conquering the freaking world.
Conquering the world. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so one of the things that I said as we started, so Dr. Ishimaru read your bio and obviously talked about your role as a leader, certainly as a congressman, my congressman, thankfully, and despite all of the redistricting, thankfully, you're still my congressman. But also your leadership at CASA. And as you know, radical care really emerged from the time that I spent certainly with other school leaders in the Bronx, but primarily spending time just hanging out in the school, in the hallway, in your office with you. And so, one of the things that I talked about was just wanting to think about, how you think of radical care, and certainly both as a school leader, but also now as a congressman.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I think of it as love, as sappy as that sounds. I mean, I really loved teaching. I loved education. I loved our students. I loved the families. I loved the community. And I guess that love comes from really feeling, like almost in a spiritual sense, that they are and were a reflection of me. And so it's kind of the same approach with constituents. I see them as a reflection of me, and anyone as having a need, whatever that need may be, whether it's academic or political or social or whatever, just doing whatever I can to help them. I mean, that's pretty much it. The thing about education, though, and schools, I mean, I think it's a space where you could clearly see the historical inequities and trauma and terror of marginalized communities. You know what I mean? Like, in the 20 years I was in education, all 20 were in Title I schools, serving mostly Black and Latino students in redline communities, right? And like redlining was a federal policy. It was like, you can't access these home loans in these new suburbs that we're going to build for these low interest rates at this low cost because you are Black. And so you have to stay in this public housing that we built for you. And we're just going to devalue that simply because you're Black. And so, like, that's policy, that's American history. And so, when you work in public schools, you see that, you see the outcomes of that every day in your underfunded schools. And then when you go visit a school in a wealthier community, you see, aquariums in schools and like design thinking labs and what is it, like a space station, like you see all kind of stuff in public schools in wealthier communities. And then when you're in the Bronx or any poor Black and brown community in the country, you may have books that are multiple years old, books that are falling apart. Literally, the building is falling apart. You have lead in the water, all kind of stuff. So, I mean, I guess radical care comes from just understanding that historical context and just understanding, like, you're driven by that mission. At least I felt driven by the mission to overturn that versus being driven by a mission to just get kids good grades. Because if you're getting good grades and you're not, and I'm not doing what I can to develop your consciousness, then, we've kind of failed as a school. So it was like, yes, do whatever we can to achieve academic excellence, but also you have to leave with a sense of consciousness of, how we got here, but also always a vision of where we're trying to go. Like, it's never like we just gonna complain and leave it there. No, how do we transform this whole thing, right? So that's kind of, and then me running for office is also, I guess, a manifestation of that, right? It's like walking the talk, if you will. Like, if I really believe in transformation, I was a teacher, then I was a counselor, then I was a principal, and I guess maybe I could have been a superintendent, but I just, at that point, for whatever reason, 2019 was like, well, if I could run for Congress and win, I could really have an impact. So let's try that. And it worked out.
It did work out, despite some of your good friends saying to you that you were a little crazy. That would be me.
Crazy. Yeah.
Clearly, I was wrong. So one of the things that I always remember, so there's obviously a few things that I remember. First, I remember I would come to the school and I'd get off the elevator and you'd be sitting right there in the hallway, right? Like you were rarely in your office, right? You had this office, beautiful mural, not that you didn't go in there, but when I would step off the elevator or come out of the stairwell, you'd just be sitting, you'd have like your computer here, you'd be in the hallway doing your work, meeting with people in the hallway. And, that was, and you'd be talking to folks, right? So I opened the book with this little vignette with, Byron Johnson, as you know, who is really Jamal Bowman. I probably should have consulted you before selecting the pseudonym, but anyway, you're like talking to kids, like you're greeting kids at the door. So tell me a little bit about, in the context, and having shadowed you one day as a staffer on one very long day, taking pictures for you. I mean, I was exhausted, right? You crisscrossed the district to different events. So tell me a little bit about how integral and essential that is to the work of leadership, right? Building those relationships.
Yeah, I mean, the first part of leadership, in my opinion, is similar to the first part of being an elected official. The most important and initial thing that you have to do is just show up. Like just show up. Like just be present. Be visible. And when you're present and you show up, what happens? You meet people, you have conversations, you watch interactions, you observe body language, you build strong relationships. And I never liked being in my office. I always felt like, even though it was a small school, I always felt far away in my office. I always felt like I was just locked away, far away somewhere else, and I wasn't in the action. And I always liked being in the action. So I would position myself in the hallway because that was like where the action was. Like the kids would always see me. They knew not to misbehave too much because the principal might be right down the hall, but it was also a chance for me to just say hello, say what's up, check in with kids, see how they were doing, talk about, shoot the shit or whatever for a couple of minutes. And that's how you just build those strong relationships and that strong rapport with your kids. The same thing goes with, being an elected official. I like being, I like just showing that, like, there's a work ethic to this, and like my motor is on a whole nother level than anyone else's motor. So I'm going to be doing double and triple what other people do in a day. And so that's twofold, right? That's to kind of just raise the expectations for myself and my colleagues in my profession. But then that's also to like meet people and build those same relationships. I mean, this is both education and politics is the relationship business. The better relationship you have with people, the more they can disagree with you on an issue, but still support you. I mean, I had many parents curse me out in the hallway, and then 2 minutes later, they're in my office laughing and joking with me. So it's that kind of relationship. And again, it comes from like where I come from as a kid, right? Like how my mother raised me, how I am with my sisters, how I was with my boys growing up. It was just, always about relationships. And then the last thing I'll say is, this goes back to the love piece, but it's also like inspiration. Like I'm motivated by things that inspire me. And whenever you get a chance to engage with a child, even for a few minutes, you can inspire them towards something that's transformational. And they can inspire you as well. Like I told people all the time, I ran for office because of my students, because I was inspired by them. And now it's about seeing what I can do while I'm here in Congress, working on their behalf and the behalf of others who are vulnerable.
So one of the other things that I remember a conversation that we had, I asked you about policy and sort of like, how the rules sort of constrain you, and you were like, well, I follow the spirit of the book.
Yeah.
And one of the really big things that comes out of just all of the years of studying leadership is that really effective leaders, I think, understand how to be very strategic and how to build those relationships, like you said, in authentic ways, but to also then leverage those relationships to ensure that policies get shifted, or that they can do certain things in their schools, right? So that you sort of figure out where the battles are. I saw that a lot when I was, at your school, and one of the main things, and the major audience on this webinar are aspiring school leaders, and there are other folks who are studying leadership, right? So that's one of and one of the sitting principles that ask for forgiveness, not permission, right? In the service of students and families. So can you talk a little bit about how you enacted that? Because that sometimes was a lonely space for you, right? At CASA. But how did you enact that? How did that, how did you make those decisions? And, how does that happen in your current role?
Yeah, so I think you probably used this phrase at some point when talking to me about some of the stuff that I did. I think you called it calculated risk. I think you've used that term before. But yeah, there was some calculated risk that I took on a consistent basis. But then also, and I learned this term when I got to Congress, I have a high risk tolerance. So like, I'll give you an example. I brought in a vendor to work with our students on an entrepreneurship class. This person was not a certified teacher, but you could bring in vendors to work with students if there was a certified teacher sitting in the classroom. So we would, for the most part, have a certified teacher in there, or someone who was acting as a certified teacher. And this person was teaching this class. And one day, she's not a certified teacher. So, you're going to run, everybody runs into challenges, whether you're certified or not. So in her struggle with this class one day, she gave the class detention, or gave a couple of kids detention or something like that, which she's really not allowed to do as a vendor. But we treated her as a staff member. Anyway, the child went home and told his mom that he was given detention by this vendor, this teacher vendor. And the mom wrote a letter to the chancellor about this vendor doing this. And the chancellor opened up an investigation into me as a principal and my relationship with this vendor and different practices within the school. This happened in my third year. And in your third year, you usually get tenure as a principal. But my tenure was held up for an additional year because I was under investigation. And this started a pattern of every other year, I was under investigation for something else that I did that was, I guess, a calculated risk. But, I guess I had high risk tolerance, so I didn't worry about it much. I always felt that if I wasn't hurting kids and if I wasn't stealing money, they couldn't really fire me. And if my test scores were good enough, they also couldn't fire me. So those were things that I just kept in the back of my mind. And I knew if I kept so there's a lot of noise in education, and here in Congress, I've learned to separate the signal from the noise. And so you got to keep the main thing. So in education, the main thing is teaching and learning. Is instruction excellent? And are we working to make sure our curriculum and instruction is excellent? So if we keep doing that, everything else takes care of itself. And so that's kind of, we kept the main thing, and then we just we took the risk where we decided to take the risk, and then Congress is the same thing. Am I serving constituents? Right? Like when constituents call the office, are they heard? Are they respected? And do we close cases? The answer to that question is yes. Do I introduce legislation that's transformational on the lives of people? Yes. Do I advocate for the things that they elected me to advocate for? Yes. So I'm doing those things. The politics and the noise around that, it's like, that's not the main thing. Keep the main thing, and just, and just go for it.
You recently I'm gonna get the language wrong, but you just recently introduced a bill.
Yes.
Okay, so you can correct me on my language of this, but on high stakes testing, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right, okay. So so very early on, your students were they were knocking it out the box, right? At CASA. For their peers, but beyond that. And they were doing it consistently. And one of the things that surprised so many people was that they weren't doing it because you had your teachers do this drill and kill. Like you had actually disrupted all of that, right? This is when you started introducing the entrepreneurship. I think at that point it was the
Genius Hour.
The Genius Hour. You had introduced the Genius Hour. And even that, like the teachers were like, what? And you're like, everybody's focusing on the things that we can't do. This is an opportunity for you to be great. I remember you said that to them. And, and they were like, all right, let's do it. Let's do it. Because, you had formed those relationships with them. But at the height of the students doing really well on these tests, you also really started speaking out across the state against the high stakes testing. And so this is sort of a continuation of that. And I'm curious about not just sort of that speaking out, which I guess is a calculated risk, right? Because it takes risk to sort of stand out there and be sort of front and center and be, in newspapers, on TVs, New York Post, et cetera, coming for you and, continuing this work in Congress now.
Yeah, so yes, exactly right. I just, there's so much more to education than a standardized test. And we still test kids every year in grades 3 through 8. And it's just not a best practice. I mean, the research shows that it's not a best practice. It narrows curriculum. It leads to test prep practices in schools. And things like project-based learning, Socratic seminar, Genius Hour, entrepreneurship, computer science and coding, STEM and STEAM, music, the arts, sports, that stuff doesn't even enter the imagination of teachers and school leaders. And that is a problem. Like, pick the highest regarded private school in the country, right? Or the top 10. Whatever they're doing in their schools from a curriculum standpoint and a resource standpoint, we should be doing in public schools. So I know they do drama, they do theater, they do music, they do design, they do experiential learning in nature, and they do reading, writing, and math, and all. They do the basics, right? But in public schools, it was like ELA math, ELA test prep, math test prep, social studies.
Don't forget the rallies. Don't forget the test rallies.
And then some science, and then January, right after your December break, you start test prep, January, February, March, and then you take the test in April. That's not education. And that's not learning. Learning is infinite. It can't be contained. You have to unlock the minds of kids and allow them to explore the world through the curriculum, through the books they read, through the conversations they have, through the trips they go on, all of it. So that's why I started to speak out against the tests, because initially, it was like a white soccer mom thing. They thought only white soccer moms didn't like the tests. And it was like, no, there are people of color who don't like it either, because it limits how we think of intelligence. And so, yeah, we spoke out, and there was a whole movement in New York, as you know, the New York opt-out movement, and a quarter of a million parents refused the test. And they had to change things as a result of that. So now that I'm in Congress, 2 years, 3 years later, we just introduced a bill called the More Teaching, Less Testing Act. And it's all about ending annual standardized tests and replacing it, giving states the choice to replace it with grade band testing, matrix testing, sampling tests, or some combination of the two, and shift the focus back on teaching and learning, formative assessment, do nows, exit tickets, quizzes, questioning, midterms, finals, quality curriculum, Socratic seminar, project-based learning, like the things that happen in real time that gives teachers immediate feedback that they could then adjust instruction and support kids in real time, while also sharing that information with parents through progress reports and other things. So yeah, and it's a very popular bill. And please, everyone on this call, contact your member of Congress to co-sponsor the bill, because it's very popular. Republicans hate testing for their own reasons, and most Democrats realize that what we've been doing doesn't work. So we'd love to get as much support as possible.
One of the comments in the chat talked about, especially after COVID, there was like that, well, and it's not after COVID, we're still, experiencing this, there's still loss, right? Can you repeat the name of the act so that people know what to agitate for?
More Teaching, Less Testing Act. More Teaching, Less Testing Act, MTLT. More Teaching, Less Testing Act. Yes, you can look it up. If you look up Congressman Jamal Bowman, More Teaching, Less Testing Act, you'll find it. And yes, you could look up co-sponsors, and if your rep is not a co-sponsor, please contact them to be a co-sponsor. And Rosa, I want to bring up something you just said, right? Like we're COVID is much better, so everybody's doing much better, but it's still here. But we talked about this, I think it was 2 weeks ago, where you told me like just some of the challenges that are happening in the New Rochelle School District, because what did everyone do? Like we went through like one of the most traumatic events in US history, a global pandemic that killed well over 1 million people. And we were isolated for over a year, almost 2 years. And then we just went back to school, like in the same way we were doing school before. And it's like, wait a minute, now is the absolute right time to rethink this whole thing. And as you know, there have been horrible tragedies in your school district and others. And when I went to talk to the kids, they were saying the same thing. Like they're treated as cattle being herded from class to class to class and then ushered out the building. And it's just like, okay, and it's just so frustrating that there's really no leadership and you talk about radical care. Like there's no exercise of minimal care. We're just sending kids right back to school. There's no understanding of the context. A global pandemic, Surgeon General identified a mental health crisis in December 2021. And everybody just kept doing school. It's like we're zombies, just going through the motions, on this assembly line, and it's like, okay, wake up. It's like we're all caught in the matrix. It's like, wake up, people.
That's right.
Like, snap out of it. Like, we got to do something else. And a mass resistance from all stakeholders, teachers, leaders, parents, can force my colleagues to wake the hell up.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And what we were talking about, not just the sort of the physical violence that's happening, the fact that schools just sort of returned. There was like maybe a year where there was like this, have grace, extend grace, give people time, no tests, testing moratorium, et cetera. And then all of a sudden it's, New York is not just back to business as usual. But now the school systems are being punished if they're not meeting their 95% attendance rate on these tests, right? And so it's just like business as usual, go back to it. And meanwhile, kids are struggling, right? Kids are struggling. My kids, friends' kids, you can't talk to parents without them saying this is happening, this is going on, mental health, all of these things. And to make matters worse, then you also don't have access to, forget about high quality mental health care, just any mental health care that you can afford, right? And so all the more reason for the adults in the school buildings, I'm not saying to be mental health care workers. What I'm saying is to care about the kids, to know their names, to say, how's it going? To say what's going on with your family. What can I help? Why are you down? What's going on? Come into my room during lunch, whatever it is.
Yeah. So, just a couple of quick things. I don't know. We need to identify what brings us joy in education. It's very important. We've been talking so much about rigor that we talk so little about joy. And joy and learning and rigorous learning can go together. It's not one or the other. And one of the things we used to do in my school to infuse joy into the school every single week is something called community circle. And community circle was simply a 21st century Jamal Bowman hip hop based assembly. And at this assembly, we would play music that was representative of the culture of the students. I may rap some bars from a song. We may have a student performance or something like that. We would shout the kids out for uplifting and supporting the school culture. We would have public apologies for anyone who harmed the school culture. And it was just a celebration of who we were as a community. This brought me personally tremendous joy, but it also brought tremendous joy to the kids in our school and the teachers and the families. There was nothing like it in the entire district and probably not in the entire city. So that was one thing. Another thing that was a non-negotiable for us, when it wasn't like a snowstorm or a rainstorm, kids were outside for recess every day, even if it was only for 20 minutes. And this was a middle school. Why? Because we valued play as part of the curriculum. And so these were things that we included in our curriculum that brought us joy. And then there were practices in classrooms that were specifically designed to bring joy as well. So we looked at joy and learning as two things that could go hand in hand. And that's exactly what was needed as we figured out how to grapple with this damn pandemic. We needed some joy, and no one was talking about joy. In New York City schools, they added testing to deal with the issue of learning loss, which is not a concept I even subscribe to, because learning is not linear. It's holistic. Like it's everything is not, okay, you learn the letter A first and then the letter B and then the letter C, and you got to learn all the letters before you get to Z. That's not how learning works. It's a holistic, associative process where it doesn't have to be sequential. So this idea that you'll lose D, and because you can't learn D, because you didn't learn D, you can't get the E and F, that ain't really how the brain works. So that's a flawed perception, but we implemented policy based on this idea of learning loss, right? So what New York City schools do, they did more testing. Like now they have 3 or 4 MAP tests, standardized tests during the school year before they get to the real test. And then the other part, real quick, I want to mention this. Opt-outs in New York State right now, Rosa, count as a level 1 against the school.
Yes.
That is insane.
I think I texted you I was sitting at a Board of Ed meeting and I was like, hold on a second.
I thought we fought against this. Like I thought we fought
against this, and now
won.
the schools that are trying to do, right, and parents and communities, so it's not just about the 95%. Now it actually counts against the school.
Yes.
And then the school gets a double sort of, and so schools against and leaders against perhaps their better sort of thinking and understanding of what joy and education and what schools should be, find themselves in a position where they may have to advocate for kids taking these tests because they will be penalized otherwise, right? It's just this like flawed logic.
I don't know how this happened. And so that's something else we're going to have to be like pushing back on, because this can't, again, we're focused on the wrong thing, right? That's not keeping the main thing. The objective is learning and exponential learning. These practices don't lead to that. And that's what's so frustrating.
Well, especially when we know that this, again, this is one of the things we've talked about in the past, right? Going to the private independent schools, kids are learning through play, all the way up. Right? They're not getting tested. They're not sitting in rows. They're not, for 40 minutes and then move to the next thing. They have the opportunity to really explore. Yeah. And on the flip side, and you mentioned this earlier, just on the flip side, all we get is, all right, well, they're not doing well on tests. Test more, test more, test more. And, let's make it fun by having a test rally, which, is insane.
A pep rally, yeah.
A pep rally for the test. So when you think about all of this, and I know we talked about this before, and this is where sort of the radical hope piece comes into the notion of radical care. And I know Freedom Dreams, when you read Freedom Dreams, you were like, this is also like amazing, right? One of the things that
I called you like, yo, Robert Kelly? Who is Robert Kelly? I need to connect with Robert Kelly. Yes.
I do remember that. So one of the things that leaders often, leaders that I'm talking to now, especially in the pandemic, new leaders, leaders who've been there for a while, they're like, how do I sustain myself in all of this? Now, I know that you are on 150 all the time, right? You're go, 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 go. Yeah. But what are the ways that how do you recharge? How do you sort of reset when, like you said, okay, so the opt-out movement, we had all of these opt-outs, we made some progress, there were significant changes, and now the system has gotten us back by making it level 1, schools get charged with a level 1 when parents opt out. Yeah. How do we sustain our energy? Take care of ourselves.
No, absolutely. So either high protein diet.
Hold on a quick second. So just to level 1 is the lowest. I'm sorry for those non-New York City, New York State folks. There are 4 levels on the New York State test, grades 3 through 8. Level 1 is the lowest. And when you have, far too many level 1 students, particularly Black and Brown students, then you get into trouble, right? You get into trouble, you start losing funding, there's all kinds of, challenges there.
Yeah. So if you opt out and you're graded as level 1, that is actually not an accurate grade for that student. Opt out means you refuse to take the test. Level 1 means you are low performing on the test. So those are 2 different things, should not be a part of policy at all. Right. So that aside, how do you sustain yourself? So he eat a high protein diet, eat a lot of green leafy vegetables, do not self-medicate too much, okay, because that could kill you, and lift weights and exercise, okay? Now, I have to tell you, over my career, I haven't practiced all these things that well, and I'm very lucky, knock on wood, that I'm still here. But now I am unapologetically religious about getting my butt to the gym at least 4 days a week. And in doing so, I feel stronger and more energized than ever. And I'm telling you, being in schools is very stressful, and working in the school system is very stressful. Being in this place, Congress is off the hook, yo, off the hook. So I need to make sure that I'm like taking care of myself, because it's off the chain here. So please, if you don't have an exercise routine, pick one up. Weight training is very, very, it's like really important. Like literally, stress lives in your like bloodstream. It's like it lives in your body. And one of the ways to exercise it out is to like lift weights. So I really encourage like exercise and or weight training, and eating as healthy as possible. And that's proteins and not really a lot of carbs. Don't really mess with no carbs like that. And don't self-medicate. If you're in your 20s, you might be able to get rid of self-medicating. Once you get to your 30s, and it's a wrap. 40s, especially, you don't do it in your 40s.
Are you still sort of a vegetarian?
No. I needed to get more protein in my diet. So I eat like eggs and sardines and chicken and salmon, and again green leafy vegetables, and yeah, no, I needed more protein. Oh, and you all probably do this, but I'll admit I didn't always do this as a younger educator. Like, go to the doctor. I mean, that might be a basic thing, but some people don't even go to the doctor, so you don't even know what your numbers are. So I started going to the doctor and knowing my numbers, so I can align my diet towards improving those numbers. And I actually shouldn't take for granted that everybody on this call does that, because I didn't always do that. But I do now, and it's like life-changing. And men out there, especially men of color, if you're over a certain age, I'm 46, get a prostate exam, get colonoscopy. I know y'all didn't expect all this on the radical care thing, but you got to radical care yourself first, right? So do all that, please. Know your numbers.
All right, so this is the time. So I'm laughing because I know that when we spoke earlier, you're like, we're not gonna talk till 8:35 or Eastern time, and I was like, all right, Jamal. Okay, so now is the time for Q&A. Dr. Ann Ishimaru has invited us invited you all to drop questions in the chat.
I know Dr. Ann. I referenced her work on my paper, on my dissertation. What's up, Dr. Ann? You're a real person?
Hey, I'm a real person. What's up,
she's a real badass person too.
I know she is. I've read her research. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you. I love hearing you talk and sharing all these practices. It's so powerful. We have a question from somebody on the call about how we work towards removing testing and focusing on students. I assume beyond the bill. Are there ways that we can collectively be doing that work?
Yeah, so I would first, let's not say beyond the bill, because passing this bill is going to be a big step towards getting this done, because it's federal policy that requires us to administer annual standardized testing grades 3 through 8. So with this bill, yes, contact your US Senator, contact your member of Congress to be a co-sponsor of this bill to help us get it across the finish line. There are policies that can be implemented locally at the state level or even at the school district level, where you can just push back and tell the feds that you're not going to do the testing. Now, that sounds crazy because we have been threatened with the withholding of Title I funds if states do not follow this policy. But I will tell you right now, there's no way they're going to take Title I funds from you if your state decided to do this. There's no infrastructure in place. The president cannot politically survive this. It's only a threat. It's not going to happen. But that is the more radical approach to what we're talking about. But this federal bill is the bill. And then lastly, just what we did with opt-out in New York, we did a lot of community organizing and parents started resisting, and that helped change the conversation. But once you change that conversation, you gotta stay with it, because it can easily bounce back to, you know, what's happening in New York again now.
And I would also add, one of the things that Jamal and I talked about frequently, yes, it was more than white parents that wanted to, you know, who opposed the test, but there was a sort of, one of the ironies is that a lot of the white parents, the well-to-do, the sort of soccer moms, really didn't understand that the conditions that they were pushing against, which was sort of the heightened emphasis on the test, the exclusion and the removal of play and resources, et cetera, all for the test, those were conditions that Black and brown kids and schools in the Bronx and other places had been experiencing for years, right? And so what we need to do is ensure that we're talking about not just removing the test and focusing on students, because that's not what good education is, but we really need to make sure that we are tying that to a conversation around equity and opportunity and access to resources. Those two things go hand in hand.
That's a great point. That kind of leads to another question about the starting point. So if we have a lot of schools or campuses where we have a culture of limiting care, Haley Fanning is wondering what's the starting point for beginning to shift that to one of radical care?
So one of the things, now Jamal's often talked about the fact that he had the benefit of starting a school, which meant that he was able to hire a team of folks that were equally committed, energized, et cetera. But hiring and having that power is a critical part of that. Not everybody has that opportunity. So you sort of have to begin to have these really difficult conversations. I find that a lot of times a really powerful activity, which I know a lot of folks do. I think Dr. O'Doherty, who's not here today, but she and Mark Gooden worked on family community walks and things of that nature to engage communities to begin to really explore beyond the school. So starting with your staff, your teachers, other folks in the school, to like get out of the school building, right? You know, very often in New York, and my students do it, very often in New York, you get off the train, you make that left, you go to this bodega, you get into the school, and that's your routine. But, there's a whole world when you walk to the right and you go to this other place. So I think one place to start to shift that climate is to understand the history of the community, to understand the communities, and to stop thinking about teaching just the content in particular and teaching the students and the families and the larger communities. That's one thing that I'd say. Jamal?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. We also, by design, were not a top-heavy school. So I did not have an assistant principal in my school and like all these administrators. We really invested in teachers, teacher assistants, but also we use that money to invest in professional development. So if you can invest in anti-racist professional development, that'll help teachers to understand the historical context of the community in which they serve and why this is bigger than just a standardized test score or 4.0 or getting kids into college, and it's about like consciousness. That training can help teachers to get there, in addition to what Rosa mentioned around going outside your school building and exploring the community. And then lastly, exercise radical care towards your teachers, like treat them with dignity, respect, care, love, and then while also holding them accountable, in terms of just high expectations of best practices of quality teachers. I think that is often that often doesn't happen. There's like this divide between teachers and administrators and school leaders, and it doesn't have to be. You know, you could treat them with love as well, and because when you do that, they're going to treat kids with love, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's always a challenge, right? Is like, you know, it's like, what is our theory about like creating a certain culture or set of conditions for children when the adults don't experience those conditions themselves? Someone asked about, what about families, and how might we continue to educate families about their rights as they relate to their children? I don't have a lot more context than that.
Yeah, I mean, just do it. I mean, one of the things we did, particularly around opt-out, was just inform parents of their right to opt out, you know, as it relates to tests. Like if you choose to not have your kid take the test, that's your choice. It's fine. This is how you do it. End of discussion. But we had a real like open door policy with parents. Like they could pop in anytime and just come hang out and talk with me or talk with staff. We just tried to be very responsive to families at all time. We tried to have a strong you know, parents association, parent teachers association. In New York, we have these things called school leadership teams where teachers and parents and some students at high schools work together to like look at budget and really have like a collective voice in the school. I don't know if you have that in other states, but that's something that you can implement. And then parents loved coming to community circle. Like that was something that they would stop by whenever they could. And then lastly, the parents in my community in the Northeast Bronx loved like my I don't know, my radical voice in education. Like they really appreciated that I was outspoken on different issues. That may not be your community, so you got to know your parents and respond accordingly. But for me, you know, parents really liked that, and it helped to build a really strong relationship.
You mentioned, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A
that
I wanted to respond to. One of the points that's raised in the book around, you know, giving great inflation versus providing genuine feedback, particularly when students are struggling and, you know, faculty or teachers have limited time. So I think first and foremost, I always think it's essential to have direct conversations with students, especially, you know, I'm teaching graduate students who have, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 graduate degrees before they come to me. And this is the first time they're hearing that there's, you know, that their writing could be improved or their ideas need to, you know, they need some support around their writing. And, you know, I have very direct conversations with them. You know, there was one time where I was, you know, struggling and Jamal was like, that's not radical care. You need to talk to that student and tell you, right? So I will say that that it is challenging, and I don't necessarily know how to provide, you know, I've never diagrammed a sentence. I don't necessarily know how to fix the thing. But that's why it's also important for us to agitate in higher ed for the resources at the college to provide the support for the students, right? So I do what I can to sort of scaffold the tasks, to change my pedagogy to ensure that students have opportunity to get feedback more frequently from me, to get peer feedback. But I also need to make sure that the institution in the writing center, et cetera, steps up and provides the resources that those students need to be successful. We've accepted them into the programs. We have a responsibility to ensure that they are successful as students and as leaders going forward.
I didn't hear the whole question, but I heard something about limited time. And one of the things that Rosa, that, you know, I guess blew Rosa's mind about CASA was, so there is generally a traditional middle school schedule, like in America, like all kids kind of go through this schedule, this amount of minutes here, this amount of minutes there, whatever. And we just kind of completely threw that out. We just tore that up, threw it out, and we redesigned the schedule in a way to give ourselves more time to do different things. So time for collaborative planning, time for small group instruction, time for, you know, the recess and community circle. we just kind of reimagined the school schedule in a way that gave us more time and flexibility to really meet the needs of kids. Time is, if you don't, quote the Matrix, if you don't take time, you won't have time. And so we never thought that it was the district who could tell us what we should be doing in our school. We figured out what we needed to be doing to best meet the needs of our kids. And again, we knew if the test scores were good enough and we didn't kill kids or hurt them or steal money, they couldn't really do anything. And so there were flexible ways, like I could share some of our old schedules where it was just like, you never seen a middle school schedule like this, but it got at all the core competencies that kids needed to continue to grow and be successful.
And I would say that the kids were successful on the test because of the disruption of the traditional way of doing things, right? They didn't have to conform. CASA didn't conform. They did all of these things, and kids experienced joy in learning and in exploration. And as a result, they learned, right? And they were successful on one measure, but also in other ways.
Yep.
And Veronica would love to see that schedule, she says in this chat. She also raises an interesting question. Think about Houston schools. I was actually just in Houston, and this is true of some schools elsewhere, are being taken over by the state. So I think this is particularly a question for you, Jamal. Do you see any way the federal government can provide support in those kinds of scenarios?
So short answer is no. Longer answer is possibly. I say no because I forget which amendment. I want to say 14th. I could be wrong. But, public education is really a state issue. And the states have jurisdiction over what happens in the schools. The federal government gets involved through Title I, through some IDEA funding, and through testing. I would like to see the federal government take a larger role, but the federal government has yet to position itself that way. Also, every Republican wants to get rid of the U.S. Department of Education, and many Democrats really want to keep it to the state. So I don't see the feds doing that anytime soon. However, again, things can change. I don't know. Things can change in the sense that the same way we organized an opt-out movement in New York State, we can organize a public education movement across the country. And so the more parents speak out, the more educators speak out, the more kids speak out around what's right. I mean, think about the March for Our Lives work that's being done around school shootings. These are all kids doing incredible work. We need teachers and parents to join them. The same thing when it comes to testing, the same thing when it comes to other aspects of schools. We need teachers to be revolutionaries. And school leaders too. And so that's how I'm always thinking about these things. I probably wouldn't be in Congress if it wasn't for not just the opt-out movement, but the Black Lives Matter movement, just as it helped to shift the consciousness of what kind of people need to be in Congress.
That's a great reminder. Jonathan is wondering if we, think about, we're talking about the dynamics that are happening on the scale of not only federal policy, but movements more broadly. But then we also think about like how our everyday practices kind of shape those kinds of climates and interactions of the kind of radical care that you all are talking about. And so Jonathan is wondering if you could give a little more detail about how do students recognize harm to the school during the assemblies, the community circles, I think you call them.
Yeah, I mean, we were very transparent about what harm was. And this goes to, and I think all of you have heard of the term restorative practice and restorative justice. So our school was like a restorative justice school, where we didn't just, if a kid committed harm, it wasn't just about the discipline, the punishment. It was about the understanding of the harm and how we got to a place of harm and how going forward we can avoid going to the place of harm. It was always about that. And it was always a conversation with the child and the family in, you know, in a setting that was about collective learning, always. You know, it was never just yelling and screaming and you got detention, you're suspended, and that's the end of it. Like, no, you know, it was, first of all, it was communicated in community circle. The thing about community circle is it gave us a chance to like always have a check-in with the school culture every week, right? So you go through this week of school and you have this check-in, right? And you remind kids about behaviors in the classroom, behaviors in the hallway, behaviors at recess, you know, that you wanted to hear feedback from them or thoughts from them on a particular thing. If something happened, you know, I mentioned the public apologies earlier, a kid would stand up and apologize to the whole school about this harm that was caused. And it wasn't like a shame thing. It was just about this. I would publicly apologize to the school in front of everyone. Like I was always modeling that behavior. Also, again, I mentioned I didn't have assistant principals and I didn't have a traditional dean of students, but I had a lot of counselors in school. So we were small. We had like 250, 260 kids, but I'm a trained counselor. I had a full-time social worker. I had another full-time guidance counselor. I had a 75% time substance abuse counselor. And then there was a point we had a visiting nurse counselor there 2 days a week. So that's 5 for 250, 260 kids. So whenever it's a different conversation when there's a conflict and kids go to a counselor versus a dean. It's just a different conversation. And I mention that because this goes into how you hire in your school, like how you hire, how you manage your budget. Again, the professional development piece was always front and center. And yeah, there were times where we just suspended kids. Yes, I mean, one time a kid brought their family to jump another kid at school and beat the crap out of them. Like, okay, you gotta go. You can't do that. But once that child comes back, they came back to restorative learning so that it didn't happen again. So that's kind of how we did it. It was hiring, it was training, it was modeling, and it was just constant engagement and conversation around the learning.
So one of the things as we close, I want to just sort of lift up a question and an important piece of this work of radical care, and the question is, how do we elevate Black joy in all schools? And one of the things that I saw day in and day out at Jamal's school was an elevation and sort of the truth and the very being of Black brilliance and Black joy. It was in the images across the school. It was in who he hired. It was in himself. It was in his lifting up of the kids and the community. It was in the music. It was in the materials, the books, the resources that students were reading. And it was in the training and the conversation. It was an explicit part of the conversation of the school, right? And so it's really, it was really central to the work that Jamal did at CASA. And it's really central to the notion of radical care and anti-racist work. And so it's not just about anti-racism, but it's about pro-Blackness. It's about, as one of the folks in planning conversations, it's about pro-indigeneity. It's really about ensuring that we are centering the folks that have been frequently marginalized and left out of the conversations, starting with those folks at the center moving from there and, you know, embracing others, because those are the folks that we often are not really centering in our work. That's really critical. So I want to really just take this time in these last few seconds before I turn it over to once again thank Congressman Bowman for taking time out of his schedule and for participating for far longer than he thought he was actually going to be able to talk, which was the biggest laugh I've had today. And really thank you to the College of Education and all of the sponsors of the leadership, the Leading Towards Justice initiative. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you to Dr. Ishimaru. And I will turn it over to Constance and Pam, who are going to talk to you all about what is next.
I want to say one thing.
Sure.
Before I go, you just, I don't know why, but as you just closed, it really resonated with me how like radical care and anti-racist pedagogy and curriculum and all of that, it's not another thing. It is the thing. Like it's the thing. It's like not, it's literally a living and breathing organism of the school. Like it's the air in the school, right? So, and I wish we had pictures of this. We painted our walls. We painted a mural on our walls of Black and Latino and Indigenous and Asian leaders throughout world history that have been social justice activists who brought transformational change to the world. Like our kids walk past Black and brown people who did incredible work all over the world throughout world history. So that was there. One. Two, we like what, 90% of our teachers were teachers of color, maybe 95%, right? So then that's two. Three, community circle. Four, I was the principal, right? So I just was always myself. Like I was not, what you get tonight is the principal they got every day, right? So that's four. Five, what they were reading. You know, like, you know, we had an all boys group reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, another one reading Decoded by Jay-Z. And then there was other books we would read, like The Color of Water and Confessions of a Part-Time Indian and A People's History of the US. Like we were reading books that were rooted in the culture as well. And then like six, the curriculum was innovative as well and creative and had like, you know, what do you call it? Coding classes and STEAM classes or whatever. I mean, shit, we built a recording studio in our school and had our kids like recording like hip hop mixtapes. Like, so like the school was like a living, breathing organism of like Black excellence. It was like a Wakanda middle school. That's what we was going for. So to me, any school, the school has to reflect who the students are. If it's not doing that, then it's failing as there's no radical care in that school if it's not reflecting who the students are. If your students are Black and brown, they need to be in that curriculum up all over the place. And so yeah, that it was the air. It just was. It wasn't another thing on top of the other things. It replaced the other things. Ripped up the schedule, we created a new one. It was all about a new thing.
Thank you.
We want to thank Dr. Rosa Rivera McCutcheon and Congressman Jamal Bowman for the wisdom, the beauty, the excitement, the possibilities, the modeling, the call out, the accountability, the joy, the Blackness, the indigeneity, the Latinx realities of your practice and your presence. We need these models and to know that what we're hoping to do and what we're dreaming about isn't something that's so lofty and so grandiose it's not accessible, but that it is just choices, day by day choices to love, to be accountable to that love and what love looks like, feels like, sounds like, smells like, tastes like in a school. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much to the entire leadership or Radical Leading for Justice team. We are really enjoying this Leading Towards Justice series. So thank you to the Anns, Ann Doherty and Ann Ishimaru. And yeah, I'm excited.
And this is just skimming the surface. We are going to continue. And so I'm really excited to be joined with Dr. Da on Monday, April 24th for a continuation conversation roundtable about this. On this call, there's a lot of practitioners and, you know, we went to church today, right? And the timing was perfect because we're here in spring, but some of us are tired. So we needed that bolt of like, nope. Remember, keep your eye on the prize, keep your focus and know who you're serving and why you're in it. And so this was just timely. And so, yes, girl, yes, we did go to church tonight. Yes. And so I know Congressman Bowman, you talked about revolutionaries. I was thinking of Kirk Franklin and his, you know, do you want a revolution? Woo, woo. Like I was like, yes, I'm about it. So anyway, okay, I digress. I'm here in partnership with Dr. Da to invite you to continue this conversation. Here's the thing. A lot of us are trying to figure out what this looks like in our practice. What does this look like in our schools? And we are giving things a try. And so the hope is that you walk away and have some takeaways to either refine or get validated or give a try and then come back and let's talk about it, because you know that whole idea of iron sharpens iron. The goal of our conversation is for us to continue sharpening each other, because it is going to be that one student, that one conversation, that one family that's going to continue this work. So click on the Scan Me, join it. It is free. Can I say that again? It is free. So you don't have to pay for anything at all. And if you register, you get copies of, I believe, 1 or 2 chapters. But guess what? You don't even have to read anything. Just come and talk, because you're living and walking the experience. And you may just come and say, hey, I want to read some more. So we look forward to having you. Look, somebody already said they know, right? Come on, Catherine. I see you. I see you, Catherine Brown. So come and join us for this conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.